And I'll put the recording on our YouTube channel, but it will take me a couple of weeks to get it to that stage. So let me introduce my co-editor, co-author, Betty O'Shaughnessy, who is going to give the introduction to the book, Modern Mayors of Chicago. And as I said, she will be doing a PowerPoint presentation. So Betty, you can share your screen. I recommend that people go to the speaker view at the top, and I think that will be the easiest way to see this. So Betty, it's the green button at the bottom.
Yeah, I got that.
Then just choose your screen. Here we go, and go to slideshow.
Hi, everybody. It's good to be back here. One of the things that these are the mayors that we are going to be covering, more or less. Okay, how do I move this?
Click your left button on the mouse.
I don't have, okay, that's not what I wanted to do. I don't have a left button because I don't have a mouse. Okay, there you go. Okay, why are we writing this book? There have been several books about Chicago's mayors, and some of them were by Holly and Green, who wrote, I think, 4 editions about Chicago's mayors. Mike Royko, a famous newspaper man for the Sun-Times and I think the Tribune and the Daily News, wrote a book about Mayor Richard J. Daley, about how corrupt he was and how he consolidated power. Milt Rakoff did a more academic approach to the same topic and also discussed the Chicago Democratic Organization by interviewing many of the people that were part of it. He became quite close to some of them. One of them was a pallbearer at his funeral. Len O'Connor was another newspaper man that wrote about Richard J. Daley, and Professor Simpson and Tom Grail have written books about the corruptness of our city. And Dick, you can clarify more of the detail I have. But what we found was an updated book on the mayors was needed because so much had changed even since Rahm Emanuel's ran. And so we have an updated anthology, and it begins with the first Chicago mayor of the post-Richard J. Daley era, which is Harold Washington. We are also going to talk about his successor, Eugene Sawyer, Richard M. Daley, Rahm Emanuel, and the present mayor, Lori Lightfoot. It's the story of Chicago as recent mayors have struggled to transform Chicago into a modern 21st century global city, which it wasn't at the beginning. But there's a lot of challenges that these mayors face and faced, and they're more in tune with what's going on in our lives now than what happened 30 years ago. One of the things that we look at when we look at mayors is that there are different mayoral styles, and different authors have described them differently. What we will do is we will describe them as establishment or progressive reform. And these are some of the mayors from the 20th century and the 21st century. Some of them were reformers and some were very much not. Edward Dunn was a progressive reformer who wanted to have municipal ownership of things like streetlights and garbage and stuff like that. That's Big Bill Thompson of the Capone era. That's Anton Cermak. That's Richard J. Daley, and you know who these 3 are, I'm assuming, or 4 are. Now, we're going to talk about establishment mayors first. They operate at the head of a centralized political organization, which most people call a party machine, which we will call that as well. And they get support from patronage workers who do everything they can to make sure that the person that got them the job is reelected, from the business community of the city, and national party leaders. Earlier establishment mayors, this is Big Bill Thompson, who was a Republican. Yes, there are Republican machines. And Anton Cermak, Ed Kelly, who made the machine started by Anton Cermak sort of moral establishment so that good old Richard J. Daley could take it over and make it extremely strong. These are the guys that we call 21st century establishment mayors, both Richard M. Daley and Rahm Emanuel. Now, establishment mayors treat the city as like a business, a corporate entity. And they look at the city as a whole, which means that they favor downtown interests, rich guys, the people that are movers and shakers. And they see themselves as the CEO. Professor Judd called them the entrepreneurial mayor. They act like the city is a business. And so their purpose is being in office, their purpose for government, they see, is generating income for the city. But the city doesn't mean the city like neighborhoods and people, it means the business interests. Now, they might enact policies that benefit the neighborhoods. They might do that, but only as a part of a policy to benefit their wealthy supporters. They see themselves as setting the city's agenda and leading the people in the neighborhoods towards supporting it and leading the people that are businessmen to support it instead of the other way around. Their supporters tend to be white, older, straight. They're socially conservative on other issues. And they very often are leaders of the city's organized labor, police, old immigrant ethnic clubs like the Polish Roman Catholic Union or the Irish American Heritage, and business organizations. Now, on the other hand, reform mayors do not see the enhancement of the central business district or tourist attractions as their primary goal, like the establishment mayors have. But they still support city improvement. Unlike establishment mayors, they work for the neighborhoods. They can be good government reformers, or they can consider themselves progressives. Now, they'll work with the big guys, the rich guys, but generally for the benefit of Chicago's community rather than the downtown guys. They represent new immigrants, Blacks, idealistic students, other young voters, progressives, liberal unions like the Service Union, left-wing, wealthy reformers like George Clooney, and sometimes small business owners find it in their interest to support progressive reform mayors because they actually listen to them. Earlier reform mayors, you have Ed Dunn here, and he tried to put in municipal ownership of things like garbage and no, not garbage, but garbage collection and stuff like that. He wanted to put in the elevated. This is, I can't remember his first name. I think it's William Deaver. And he was, Holly called him the Jimmy Carter of his era because he was very good and very honest and very earnest and totally ineffective. Sorry. Recent reform leaders, Harold Washington, Lori Lightfoot. Now, the establishment and progressive reform people differ in how they get elected. Establishment, they campaign issues of interest to the major city powers. You saw that picture that I had of Mayor Daley on that, all those other mayors, and it said, good for Chicago. They see their interests as what's good for Chicago. They want TIFs. They want to promote tourism. They want to get other income to the city because it will benefit them. And that's what their campaigns center on. They get support from wealthy donors, loyal party members, which means most part patronage workers, but also people whose family have always been Democratic or Republican, if there is such a thing. But they also will get support from businessmen who just donate and hire people that they want and stuff like that. Paid media, when they are campaigning, they have expensive, very expensive, oftentimes, campaign commercials. Reform candidates, on the other hand, deal with issues of interest to the community, schools, local zoning, police protection, snow and garbage removal, things that people care about in their everyday lives. They appeal to the community groups to get their support. They get small town donors, the community groups. They have people that support them knocking on doors. Boots on the ground is still one of the most effective way to get votes. And they call press conferences, they concentrate on what's in the news. Free media is free media, and they take advantage of it. Now, the thing about mayors is that they're not all perfectly progressive reform or perfectly establishment, although I think Richard J. Daley came pretty close. The differences between establishment reform mayors and reform mayors are not absolute. Richard J. Daley was I think the first mayor, correct me if I'm wrong, to march in the Gay Pride Parade. He was very, very much supportive of them, and they supported him as a result.
Richard M. Daley.
Richard M. Did I say J?
Yeah,
Sorry.
yeah.
No, Richard J. would have dropped dead. Harold Washington was a community guy. He was a neighborhood guy. Everybody knew that about him. But he worked towards the renewal of Navy Pier, which was a very different way he would renew Navy Pier than the later guys did, than Richard M. Daley did. He had places for community meetings in Navy Pier then. And he also was responsible for getting the new downtown library done, as opposed to the old downtown library we had. The building behind me is Harold's library. Now, one of the things that we did in the book was we tried to get everybody kind of on the same page. And so we asked everybody to write, all the people that are writing this in thousands, address these three questions. How did this person become mayor? Were they elected with 90% of the vote? Well, that's an exaggeration, but with 70% of the vote? Did they become mayor in some really weird way like Eugene Sawyer did? Or was it someplace in between? Did they barely win? Did they win by a landslide? The second question and who voted for him? What was the campaign like? Was it full of money? Was it a lot of knocking on doors? Other question, did this mayor have a rubber stamp city council where they voted for him over 90% of the time, anything that he wanted? Or one that was more independent? Somebody like the council wars that Harold Washington suffered through? Or was it someplace in between, like with different factions, like Lightfoot sees? The third question, which is probably the most important, what was this mayor's legacy? Was it good? Was it bad? Most of them are mixed. What is lasting? What has not gone away? And what has completely disappeared?
And we'll probably need to end there, Betty, so everybody
Yes.
else has time.
Yes,
If you can undo the screen.
yes, I did. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Betty. And so we're going to, so this is the background of the book as a total. It's also an arc between Harold Washington and Lori Lightfoot and what's happened in between. And we're going to take the chapters in order. So I would ask the authors first of all, if there is any pressing question of something you didn't understand about Betty's, not substantive issues, but you didn't understand something she said, are there any questions just for clarification? Okay, I'll ask the authors of the Harold Washington chapter to introduce themselves and to present Harold Washington, the first mayor in our anthology.
Hi, my name is Tolela, and I'm here at George Washington University with Greg Squires. I'm speaking on behalf of both of us.
And just before you start, I think one interesting question that's particularly interesting is you were both sociologists, not political scientists, and you're from South Africa. Why would someone from South Africa and someone who's a sociologist be interested in Harold Washington and Chicago?
Well, that's a perfect way to segue into my discussion, actually. And I'm going to start with the last of the three questions about Harold Washington's legacy, because it ties to why I would have been interested in working on him. And this started for me as a PhD dissertation at Cornell University under the supervision of Pierre Claver. And that there's a certain paradox about Harold Washington and his legacy, which is, why would someone who spent almost only one term in office, he was re-elected, of course, but died early in his second term, right? Why would somebody like that attract the interest of people all over the world? Why would it attract me to do my PhD on that? Why would it attract somebody like Barack Obama? Why would it make Barack Obama leave whatever he was doing in New York and move out to Chicago? Why would Harold Washington cause the African National Congress of Nelson Mandela decide to send a delegation to Chicago? So there's a paradox then in this kind of short term in government, but outsized influence. And this has, so how does one get to that? One way to get to that is what we call the cultural impact in Harold Washington, in Harold Washington's governance in Chicago. Generally, books about mayors, tend to be about mayors who've been in office for decades, and the authors are often spoiled for, a lot of details about their projects and all of that. But what we've decided to do is to look at Washington's strategic impact on Chicago. And by that, we mean how he shaped the direction of the city. Now, obviously, no reformer and no transformation takes place overnight. Harold Washington was building on a movement that had been going on in Chicago, even under the nose of Mayor Daley, that there was a lot of unhappiness in Chicago, and of course, leading to the election of somebody like Jane Byrne. So we don't want to present Harold Washington as this figure who kind of in a cataclysmic way just transformed Chicago. There was a current of change happening over time. And also speaking about, this tension between establishment and reform mayors. I mean, Harold was a bit of both. He grew up in the machine. His father was a part of the machine. And, so he was like any other politician, right? He weighed his chances and went to actually challenge the machine. So we begin our chapter by locating Harold within this history of the machine and his own family's participation in it. We trace the machine obviously to the post-1930 democratic routing of the Republicans under Anton Cermak. And then we moved to, and we're really grateful for the reviewers because we really didn't pay much attention initially to the work, to the influence of somebody like Ed Kelly. So we pay particular attention to the role that Kelly played in centralizing the machine, in institutionalizing the machine, in many ways in taking Anton Cermak's work forward, and ultimately, of course, to Richard J. Daley. So the first and most logical, and of course we deal with Kennelly as a civic reformer mayor as well. But the first major point we make is that it is really with Washington that there's a cultural change in the governance of the city. That even though there were these other changes, the participation and the substantive participation of Black people in the city's government, and to a lesser extent, the Latino community, That is a major shift in a way that had never happened before, and the increase in giving women positions of influence in government. But there were also policy developments, right? And so in the second part of the paper, right, the first part is the historical part. In the second part of the paper, we focus on the actual policy changes that Harold Washington implemented. And these policy measures, there are three of them that we really focus on because they highlight three central elements of his legacy. The first element of his legacy was this attempt, real attempt, and with some successes, in getting neighborhoods involved in public policy making. And we look particularly at the role that community organizations played in the formation of the budget, where the money actually was. And I mean, with people like Daley, right? I mean, the first thing Daley did always was to make sure that he was in control of the budget. And the chairman of the finance committees made sure that they were in charge of the budget. What's really interesting about this particular section of the paper is how Harold Washington got into this tension, right? The so-called council wars with the city council. A city council that, even though it was dominated by Democrats, had become his opposition. But how Harold Washington strategically got into this brinksmanship, if you like, with the city council. And in many ways, though not always 100%, in many ways, he got his neighborhood, his bond issues, for example, for the neighborhoods, and how he got what he wanted in terms of the use of CDBG grants, right? That the white aldermen always wanted that money, right, to be used for their neighborhoods, even though that was illegal, right? But this majority in the city council, right, was always trying to appropriate this funding. So we discussed that in some detail, and we suggest that that was really a big impact in Chicago, and the budget could not be just a matter that was decided only by a few white men behind closed doors. Second, a central element in Washington's campaign and mayoralty was the emphasis on neighborhood economic development, especially under the leadership of his Commissioner of Economic Development, Rob Meehan. And here we discuss the Washington papers, that were developed by people like Carrie Moe during the campaign, and how those Washington papers were translated into public policy. And how that, in a way, gave communities a sense of participation and neighborhood organizations a sense of participation in local economic development. We focus in particular on the so-called, actually they became the planned manufacturing districts that were championed by Donna Duchamp. And these were attempts, part of the larger scheme of Harold Washington, of protecting and creating jobs in the neighborhoods, instead of just leaving the city to work in the interest of the downtown areas. And this planned manufacturing districts, right, question the notion of the city as just a matter of moving to a service economy, and that manufacturing was something of the past. So And what's important in terms of the legacy is that this planned manufacturing district actually became part of the subsequent administrations. And Donna Ducharme had a lot to do that by staying in the administrations of Eugene Sawyer and Richard M. Daley. Even Rob Meir actually and Karen Moe, I think they stayed in Eugene Sawyer's administration. The third and final sort of empirical example is on affirmative action and how Harold used an executive order to make sure that Black people, Latinos, and women became involved in the work of the city. And there's a phrase that Dick used when I interviewed him many years ago, that there was a time before Harold Washington and there was a time after Harold Washington. I really like that phrase because for the first time, again, you get young Black lawyers getting into the administration. So we focus on the law department under James Montgomery and Judson Minor, and how you get this influx of young lawyers into the administration. And they really professionalize the law department. And they work very closely with purchasing and contracts under somebody called Mary Skipton in professionalizing and breaking the corruption that had its hold on the Department of Purchasing and Contracts and on the law department. And so in a nutshell, and to wrap up, what we suggest is that when we're speaking about cultural change, we don't mean that in any abstract manner. There's empirical evidence of how city government actually worked in a different way because of the way Harold Washington led the city.
Thank you very much. And Greg, you had a few comments as well.
Yeah, I'm listening to you and Betty and Kalela. There are just a couple of quick things I would like to offer. First, in response to your question is, how does a sociologist get interested in this stuff? Dick, as you know, I spent several years working for the Chicago Regional Office of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. And one of the first things I did was testify before the Chicago City Council on an insurance discrimination study we did. And it was not very well received, but it was a great experience for me. And then I linked up with Larry Bennett and Kathy McCourt and Phil Nyden and wrote a book about Chicago politics in the late 80s that featured Harold Washington. So then when I ran into Kalela at GW and read about your book, it gave me an opportunity to revisit some old memories. And the one thought I wanted to share that I think is that your book is really going to contribute to is the idea that when we tend to think about history, I think there's a tendency to think that what happened in the past was almost inevitable. It had to play out that way. Michael Katz was a great historian who wrote about cities, particularly school systems, what the so-called deserving and undeserving poor, social welfare states. And he often talked about and wrote about how history could have gone so many different ways, so dramatically, if just a few things had gone differently. And we tend to not appreciate that things didn't just happen inevitably. And I'm reminded of when Harold Washington won the Democratic primary in 1983, he got 36% of the vote. He fortuitously ran against two strong white candidates. If that hadn't been the case, if it had only been Jane Byrne or Richie Daley, Washington probably would have gotten about the same 36%. And that, I mean, landslide would not fairly describe how badly he would have been defeated with that. He would have been not even a footnote in Chicago history, I don't think. But he did win the Democratic primary with 36% of the vote and went on to have a dramatic influence politically, culturally, and economically, as Kalela has laid out. The library downtown speaks to his significance. And I think the lesson here, where I think your book really chimes in, is the current reality of cities and city politics and the future of cities and city politics are contested terrain. there's nothing inevitable about what's going to happen. As I read your introduction, Dick, and what I've read of the various chapters, there's a lot of guidance here on the various directions the city of Chicago could take in the future. And there's nothing inevitable about what direction it will be. And I think your book will do a nice job of laying out some of the options that we can choose from if we're so inclined.
Thank you, Greg. Are there any questions from students that are for clarification? Let me introduce then Monroe Anderson, who was his many wonderful accolades, and I won't go into them all, but is known particularly for the purposes of this book as the press secretary for Eugene Sawyer, and was there for many of the key historic scenes in the city's history. Was a journalist before and after that, and has again, the authors of this book come not just from political science, but from journalism, from sociology, and from other disciplines. So Monroe, talk us through what happened after Harold with Gene.
Okay. First of all, what happened? Harold had such an important influence on the city that you have to view everything that happened in the light of his election, what happened as a result of his election, and how when he died suddenly, where things happened, what things happened after that. I had been, when Harold won the election, I was a Chicago Tribune reporter. I had written an op-ed page piece earlier, before he won the election, predicting that the next mayor of Chicago would be Black, for reasons that have been explained by the two previous speakers. I was asked to be Harold Washington's press secretary and chose not to, because I had covered Black Chicago for the Tribune for years, but I didn't know much about politics because there was no such thing. I eventually became the first Black reporter from a major newspaper to cover City Hall. So it was all very brand new. I covered City Hall. I knew Harold, I knew Sawyer, I knew Evans. I knew all of the Black aldermen well. There was no heir apparent. When Harold Washington talked about being mayor for 20 years, he was not really joking. I'm sure somewhere in the back of his mind, he may have realized that he may not live for 20 years, but basically what he was saying was he was going to be mayor forever, as Daley, Richard J. Daley had been. My chapter starts with the death of Harold Washington. When he died, a couple of things happened. Some of the aldermen, Tim Evans, the prime one among them, went to Northwestern Hospital, to the emergency room, because it was reported that he had had a heart attack, but it had not been reported that he was dead. So they went there. A number of the other aldermen, Black and white, went to City Hall and started forming meetings, holding meetings to see who would be Harold's successor. The Black aldermen were very concerned about that because of Wilson Frost, Alderman Wilson Frost. Frost had been an alderman when Richard J. Daley died of a heart attack. And he was president pro tem of the council. And so he believed that he was the natural successor just by a position, that he should be the next mayor. The white alderman locked Frost out of a meeting. They held a meeting, And they named another white successor, Mike Bolandic, who was also from Daley's 11th Ward, as the successor. These council wars have been going on for much of Harold's first term. And the positions were still set. And so no one was in favor of, no one from the 21 side was in favor of anyone from the 29 side. The white aldermen, the 29, the bunch of the 29, were positioning themselves to repeat what had happened after Richard J. Daley's death. They were going to name one of their own. Cook County President George Dunn, who was a power back then, said, no, you cannot do that. If you put a white person in Harold Washington's seat, there will be rioting in the streets of Chicago. So what the white aldermen decided to do was they would name someone they thought that they could handle. That was Eugene Sawyer. Sawyer was the longest running Black alderman in the council at that time. He was well liked, but he was invisible. When the alderman eventually selected him after a ferocious battle, political battle, December 1 and December 2, people did research on Sawyer. There was not one taped interview. There was not one newspaper interview. Sawyer had never dealt with the media whatsoever. No one thought of Sawyer as being mayor, including Sawyer. And suddenly he was. The reason Alderman Mell and others pushed Sawyer, their thinking was, well, he would either follow their will or they would get rid of him. The other faction in the Black community became split, much like the white community had been, which led to the election of Harold Washington. The Black community became split between Sawyer and Evans. Those who supported Sawyer saw him as the obvious and natural successor to Harold Washington, because he was quite eloquent in speech. He was a lawyer, and he had been Washington's floor leader. Sawyer was basically someone who was in the weeds. He knew a lot about city government and departments and everything, but he was not a good speaker at all. He was a soft speaker when he spoke. And so there was an immediate split with a bunch of Evans opponents, supporters outside of City Hall. And there was this battle that went on until the wee hours of December 2nd. Sawyer finally emerged as the mayor. And in the meantime, those who wanted Evans started this whole rumor that Sawyer was an Uncle Tom, and he had been bought out by the white aldermen, the supporters, the former aldermen who were part of the 29. During his short term, he was only in office from January 2nd of 88 to April 23rd or 24th, 89. Then he was defeated by Daley. During his term, he did everything that he could to implement what had been Harold Washington's policies, to try and prove that he was not, in fact, a sellout or part of the 29, the white aldermen. In fact, when I was press secretary, Alderman Mell came into my office one day and handed me a list of names. And he says, you tell Gene that either he hires his guy, these guys, or we're going to run one of our guys against him and put him out. I delivered the message to Mayor Sawyer, and he shrugged, because all he had was, in reality, when there was going to be a vote, was the same group of people that Harold Washington had. In the meantime, during his mayoralty, he had all sorts of opposition. One of the women in my press office was on the radio one day supporting Evans in an interview. The mayor's security, who had been Harold Washington's security and now Sawyer's security, they said, "Isn't that Sharon? What's she doing there?" I had to fire her. That's the one and only person I've ever fired in my life. I explained to her, her job was to represent the mayor, not a political candidate. Sawyer spent much of his months as acting mayor trying to implement Washington's policies, but the city council had become so every man for himself in mentality that they didn't support him a lot, which was rare for a Chicago mayor, except Harold during the 29, the council wars. That just didn't happen. Sawyer, the other thing that happened was the alderman who put Sawyer in, voted him in, didn't support many of his policies. And Evans people who were against Sawyer did support it because Sawyer was presenting Harold Washington's program. And so Sawyer had a very bumpy term in office with little support. And Evans, their split was such a nature that Daley had no problems getting elected. First, he defeated Sawyer in the primary, and Evans had graciously stepped back so he to run in the general, where he thought he could beat Daley, and neither one. My chapter will go through much of that, and since I've witnessed a lot of it and was involved in a lot of it, I will have a mixture of some personal observations and some research from people like Dick. That's it.
Thank you, Monroe. Any questions for clarification? Some of our authors are going to have to leave early, so we're not going to take our usual 5 o'clock break. We'll go directly to to Costas and Richard M. Daley and the story of the Daley election. And then next week, we will be picking up with the post Rahm Emanuel and so forth, Lori Lightfoot, the post Richard M. Daley mayors. So Costas, bring us home for today. What is the story of the Richard M. Daley era that followed Eugene Sawyer?
Yeah, thank you very much, Dick. Thank you. Just a couple of observations. First of all, as you heard from Mr. Anderson and before that on following the untimely death of Harold Washington and the developments with Mayor Sawyer, Daley, who aspired obviously from much earlier than '89 to be elected in the office of mayor, he finally successfully entered the office in 1989. Now, the one thing I wanted to also know, Professor Squires noted this about the fact that there are multiple paths, and I very much agree on that. And I think that to a great extent, Daley kind of reflects in some ways, while there's a very much a direction there, he shifted and changed along the way and embraced different approaches in terms of his leadership style as well as the outcomes. Our work with Dennis Judd, and my understanding is that you've met or you've had an opportunity to engage with Dennis. Our work on Richard M. Daley on this chapter is drawn from a book that we published titled Building the City of Spectacle, Richard M. Daley and the Remaking of Chicago. And we felt that the notion of, we use the word remaking, because to a great extent, what you've heard about has been this transition of Chicago from an era, the industrial part or its past, to obviously a very much a new era that Daley embraced and he pursued aggressively. So our work examines the impact of Richard M. Daley's mayoralty on Chicago and urban politics. So as I mentioned a moment ago, he arrived in 1989 and he served until 2011. I think there were many, many years in between that nobody thought that Daley would ever leave the office. He was such a fixture in Chicago's mayor's office and in the history. Of course, his relationship or his past with his father placed the Daleys in the forefront of Chicago's history. And all you had to do is say the word Daley and people very quickly identified the Daleys as the rulers of the city of Chicago. He served for 6 terms in office, 22 years, and is interestingly the longest serving mayor of the history of the city, longer than his father. The notion of his connection to his father was always in the forefront, and there were always comparisons to the father. In fact, when Daley was elected into office, a lot of people assumed right away that he would be just like his father and he would continue on the policies or the approach that his father took. Of course, the one thing that's very important is that Chicago was a very different city at the time, or at least globally things were changing and the society as a whole was changing. So he had to be in that context. However, I think what's important to note, one of the questions that emerged when Daley was elected was, did he actually have a vision? Did Daley have a vision? And I say this because for those that followed those years, discovered that Daley just fumbled quite a bit. He was very uncomfortable a lot of times. He was not the quote unquote politician you would think. He was not a smooth operator. There were always references in the media about some misstep that he took, or he said the wrong thing. So to a great extent, it would not be possible for somebody like that to actually have a vision. At least a lot of people thought that it's not very possible for somebody who certainly doesn't have it together to have a vision a grand vision for the city of Chicago. Our argument in the chapter and obviously in the book is that Daley, in fact, did have a vision. And he goes back to Professor Squires' observation about a path, if you will, that he did have a vision. And we do not agree with the notion that he operated a political machine. I think the times were very, very different. I think Dick probably could have something to say about that. But our approach there is that he proved to be a shrewd politician in the very end, not the fumbling individual that was laughed at, or he was a lot of jokes were put forward about him. His focus, from our perspective, is on transforming Chicago's economy and urban culture. And what we argue is that he pushed very hard into advancing what we call the city of spectacle, is to transition Chicago from this industrial past to, a history that obviously occupied a lot of other cities in the upper Midwest, like Cleveland, Detroit, and Milwaukee, and look to trying to transition Chicago in a different area. And he also arrived during an uncertain period of times. You've heard about the Council of Wars, the reference to Chicago as Beirut by the lake. So he came in as a liberator, if you will, or to provide a new direction. And in that regard, one of the clear outcomes was his pursuit of an aggressive program of construction that focused on signature projects. So projects along the city's lakefront, so things like the Millennium Park, Navy Pier, redoing Navy Pier, the museum campus, Northerly Island, Soldier Field, 2 expansions of McCormick Place, which is the city's convention center. He proposed other initiatives along the way. And the other thing that is certainly one of the outcomes during the years of Daley has been extensive residential development, extensive gentrification in and around the Loop, and possibly one of the very, very visible aspects of these years was massive beautification. Daley focused extensively on beautifying, and wherever there was a spot for a planter or a flower, definitely you'd see it right there. In fact, for years in front of, I was able to observe firsthand in front of the Art Institute, the dividers, the planters that were installed in some of the thoroughfares that sometimes they caused accidents, but I would see trees appear and disappear depending upon what season we were during the year. And that's how the city expended a lot of money on that. Daley was certainly focused on the downtown area very extensively, and that's been significantly transitioned. The other thing I forgot to mention here is if you look at the Maggie Daley Park, a lot of that started actually, though it concluded with his successor, as well as the river, the Chicago River, the riverfront that also started during Daley or attending to all these areas. So there was a lot of activity along the way that took place. He was heavily criticized, Daley, for building a tourist-oriented economy and infrastructure at the expense of other priorities. And when I talk about other priorities, one could argue that the neighborhood certainly did not see or experience the advantages that the city's lakefront and the residential development around the Loop we were able to observe. To go back to 1989, Daley appeared as a reformer and as a manager. One of the things he started to do very early on was, though a Democrat and progressive in a lot of ways, he advocated for privatizing services. He took a very hard approach to slashing budgets and redirecting resources, improving, being more efficient or more effective. Something that actually was appreciated interestingly enough, by many segments of the Chicago's population. So a lot of people actually appreciated his view, the view of him as a reformer and a manager. And I know that historically other mayors have appeared this way too along the way, but he was to a great extent the darling of the media. I'm talking about the national media, Time Magazine, Newsweek. A lot of articles covered him, even cities outside the United States. I think it'd be interesting to look at, and we've done a little bit of that, to look at the city of Toronto. The city of Toronto looked at Daley as actually somebody to be emulated in terms of helping the city of Toronto advance. He also evolved as a leader. I think one of the clear indications how Daley arrived in 1989 to, let's say, the mid 90s, and how Daley was before he left office. He started out by being kind of insecure. However, he became more and more comfortable in the position. And of course, some of us are very much familiar with his marking the X spots on the airport, Northerly Island, and transitioning the small airport into a park in the middle of the night. His pursuit of the Olympics was another example, I think, where would indicate his level of comfort and his sense of even the approval of over $600 million to upgrade Soldier Field. So he operated very much as a ruler by the time he left office, and he certainly made a lot of people uncomfortable by his increased level of comfort and his drive. One of the things that's very interesting about Daley is that along the way, he embraced Daniel Burnham quite extensively in the 1909 plan. A lot of times he talked about how important it is because of the grandiose vision of Daniel Burnham. There's a lot of references in his outlook and his speeches. One that comes to my mind is the work on the museum campus. During the unfolding of the museum campus, he declared that this is something that Daniel Burnham would be very proud of, because it just gave all this by moving Lakeshore Drive to the west. It opened it up for park space, and Burnham would be very proud. So his notion of grandiose vision, the Columbian Exposition of 1893, references to that, the 1909 Plan of Chicago. So again, all that contributed to what I shared earlier about his image as a reformer, an efficient administrator with a goal. And again, as I said, he got a lot of national and international visibility. But one of the things about Daley is he also, we started to uncover patterns of corruption that took place. Certainly Daley utilized the aldermen to buy the aldermen's loyal support. He allowed them authority to and to seek their approval for a lot of his directives and initiatives, including TIFs, for example. He allowed them to operate their wards virtually as independent feudal fiefdoms. And and for many of them, the temptation to use the prerogatives of personal financial gain proved too tempting to resist, which in the very end resulted in a lot of investigations on aldermen, and many of them ended up in under federal scrutiny and ultimately in jail. A number of controversies during the Daley period. I think some of them would include his public housing initiative that resulted into, or the effort to try to diversify with mixed housing and attention to some of that, and pushing people outside the city and beyond those environments. Educational reforms, I think, would be declared as being a mixed results, and that was another major criticism of his period. And I think the last thing that I wanted to note here is the fiscal mess that he left the city. I think if you look at the parking situation in downtown Chicago, the Skyway, for example, some of those deals that he pursued as a way to balance budgets from the extensive expenditures proved, I think we'd all agree, to backfire. The cost of privatizing those resources resulted into significant expenses, made the city less attractive in many ways, and of course, it's something that cannot be brought back. But he left the city behind in very, very difficult and very, very challenging period. The one last thing I want to share with you is that Daley, interestingly enough, has disappeared extensively. I mean, you just don't see as somebody who played such a critical role in Chicago's history for such a long period of time. He very quickly disappeared from the public eye, and he certainly did not get involved. I think the one or two times had been some popularized coverage about some relationship or something like that in the media that he's had, or if there was some legal issue that came back and he had to testify, or he was called for that. But overall, he's just disappeared. I think that what is clear about the period is that he focused on the tourist economy. He advocated for Chicago as a global city. At the time, a lot of conversations as to what it means to be a global city. And some of you may remember references to first tier, second tier, third tier, fourth tier, who knows what tier one would be. But he certainly pursued a lot of those initiatives and talked about that. He also traveled abroad and brought a lot of things back to the city. The Cows and Parade is one example of it that we may remember. He visited Austria. So whenever he would see something, he would bring it back because he felt that would help the cultural aspect of the city. The Earth Globes is another public exhibit that we saw. So, but overall, it was very clear that his goal was the downtown area, and that ended up reorganizing, obviously, not only the core and the lakefront, which was expended. Dennis and I kind of estimate probably close to $6 billion in expenditures during that period, but also the surrounding Loop area and the development that took place in the near west side and the near south side primarily. So with that, I will end, Dick, and turn it over to you.
Thank you, Kostas. So we can now take comments and questions. The way you can help us most is suggest to the authors things you might disagree with, things that you might not understand, things that you would like to, that you thought was really a good emphasis that helps you understand Chicago better than you did before. And so we're open to the floor, and the authors are also quite free to speak back and forth about how your chapter relates to the other chapter or to Betty's introduction. We're trying to polish it. For those that are students here, you're getting to see the sausage made. This isn't a finished book. This is a set of manuscripts that we're in various stages of revision and work. And we do have a deadline. We have to finish the entire manuscript in perfect form by February. And that means a lot of work for us, and you can help. So questions you have, suggestions you have, things, themes, or topics that struck you, controversies you disagree with the author of some chapter about some aspect. The floor is open. Go
Okay.
ahead, Rodrigo. Rodrigo, you had a question, and then back to Monroe.
Yeah, Vijay, do you want to go first?
Who spoke first? Did
Well,
you see
one of
I think you
first?
did. You're good to go. Don't worry.
Okay, Vijay.
So I think in the introduction chapter, the book talked, this is a question. The book talks about how Lori Lightfoot is a reform mayor, but she's not doing so well on the police reform front. So my question is, for reform stuff, she has been doing well, but for the progressive stuff, she's not. And I'm just
Yeah,
wondering why.
let's hold that question till next week when we have the Lori Lightfoot chapter,
Oh, sorry.
because we will have it next week. And so we're working on the period, the overall approach Betty presented,
Mhm.
and the period from Harold Washington through Richard M. Daley. Emmanuel Lightfoot and the conclusion of the book will come next week. Rodrigo, did you have a comment? And then we'll go to Monroe.
Yeah, absolutely. So what I was thinking is that the striking differences between the two Daley administrations, and especially all the reform efforts in between, to keep it short, I would comment and ask, do you see the changes that Richard M. Daley had to do to the machine, the whole way that he had to reset up it and sort of reinvent it, as a testament to the reformers' success in trying to sort of curb this whole process of corruptions and so forth? Is it also a combination of the change of times and the way that he had to set up different coalitions? How would you see that whole change in paradigm, and how much does reform effort speak to it?
So Kostas, I think that's a comment to you.
Yeah, my thinking is that I think, Rodrigo, you're absolutely right. I would go with, if I remember correctly, the latter part of your observation. I think that mayors are, or leaders are, you have to look at them within a context, their context of their environment within they operate. And I think that applies to the current mayor in Chicago. And we think actually that Daley would just be completely out of step with what's happening right now in our society as a whole. And his orientation, outlook, perspective. I do though think that he, going back to the original observation about how he, did he have a vision? Did he have a plan? I mean, he's much more of a shrewd politician that people may think of him if they listened to him or read about some of his missteps along the way. So he did adjust along the way. Now, on the other hand, I think historically mayors in Chicago have always looked, for example, to certain, the North, or even if you look at law firms, for example, you look at law firms to get support. I mean, a lot of people that lived in the North suburbs, but they commuted to downtown for work, they actually they've always, I think from my sense of it, they've always played a very important role in terms of shaping the direction of the city, or at least contributing to that. So you have to look at the opportunities that exist so you're able to govern, and you have to take advantage of those opportunities. And the reason for that is because times are different and times change.
Monroe, you were trying to get in a comment first before we go
Yeah,
to David?
yeah. I want to tell Costas that after I left and Daley became mayor, I went to work for WBBM TV, and I ran into the mayor at the station one day, and I suggested to him, Mayor Daley, I suggested that we try to bring the Olympics here. And that's when he was in his reformer stage. So he said, no, it was too corrupt, and it was too, you had to pay bids and all these things. So it was not a good idea. Years later, into his terms, we know he tried to bring the Olympics here. So I never figured that out, except that he was done pretending to be a reformer, and he was on to being a Daley.
Yeah, yeah. And it could be, just very briefly, it could be also, I don't know if you think this, Monroe or others, it also could be that pursuing the Olympics in 89, 90 for somebody that steps in and maybe insecure or trying to figure it out is too big of a goal. But however, fast forward, 15 years later, when you're established with, getting reelected over and over and over and over, all of a sudden it's like, oh, I could really pursue this, or I can really make it happen. You start to become too comfortable with yourself. So I don't know if that played a role in it, but it's interesting that you referenced that, and obviously you responded only to say no, but yet they'll pursue that aggressively and single-handedly, 15 or so or 18 years later.
I made
Yeah,
the comment on Richard J. Daley, and then later, it's true for Richard M., that the longer they stayed in power, the more arrogant and the less willing to deal with opposition they were. Even Richard J. Daley started out when there were 14 Republicans in the city council, being very nice to the city council and very glad they passed his first budget in 1956. So there's something about gaining power and being the mayor. It's like being God. Everyone says, hello, Mr. Mayor, how are you today? No matter what their station in life. And that does have an effect on someone in government. Let's go to David and his question or comment, and then we'll circle back around to everyone. David?
Thank you very much. I greatly appreciate the input in your work and your current conference, which got me thinking that a lot of these urban problems seems to have a core of redistribution issues, housing issues, and it got me thinking about the contemporary situation in Berlin, Germany, where the municipal government is calling the Senate to draft a law to expropriate and socialize large housing groups, which is very much different from housing, from public housing, but it sounds like a more progressive and sustained solution for the problems of homelessness and wealthy redistribution. So my question goes beyond the bounds of your current work, but I wanted to ask if in your experience, do you know of some other projects like that, like expropriate and socialize large housing groups? I also heard of initiatives like this in London, where a lot of buildings were kept by sham financial corporations that will use them for laundering money and tax evasion. How is the situation in Chicago, in the States, regarding law expropriation and socialization of housing groups, in your experience?
So one of the things that has happened here during the Richard M. Daley period is what, instead of appropriating a lot of buildings, what they did was knock down the public housing with the promise that they would build mixed income housing instead. And the problem was they got rid of 25,000 units of public housing and only built 5,000 new units of low income housing as part of the mixed income units. So it was a very different kind of process. On the other hand, under the Lori Lightfoot administration, the new budget is calling for $200 million to be spent to improve the situation of the homeless. And that's only possible because of the Federal Rescue Act. I don't know, Kostas, if you or others have other commentary about, we've never really, since we built public housing, we don't seem to have any idea of how to create large amounts of affordable housing. And I know Greg is an expert on this, so I'm gonna take Kostas first and Greg second.
I was simply going to say that one of the things about Daley, he opposed affordable housing. He didn't support affordable housing, or at least when it came to working with developers and having a percentage of housing for that particular purpose. So from what I remember, there was much debate and battle between his desire to attract developers to build towers and housing in the city at the same time. And I'm trying to remember, maybe Greg remembers the percentages. I don't want to say 10% or something like that, Greg, if I'm right on that. I don't know. But I mean, certainly he did not want to move in any way, shape, or form, though, that any kind of direction would make it difficult for developers to generate profit and realize profit.
Greg?
Yeah, I don't remember the number of them, but in thinking about housing, the one positive development that occurs to me that is going on around the country, actually, more and more community-based organizations are negotiating community benefit agreements with developers, where they are getting commitments from developers to build so many affordable housing units, to hire local residents, to provide daycare and other amenities that the community wants. In return, that the community groups, even the very aggressive left progressive ones, offer to help developers get their plans approved by city council. I know that the National Community Investment Coalition, for example, with their members, they've negotiated a number of multi-billion-dollar agreements with major financial institutions to invest in low and moderate income housing and community development initiatives. So I think this is an area where we have seen some positive changes in recent years. I mean, there's always been sort of a little bit of fair housing advocacy in Chicago and elsewhere. But we're seeing with the Right to the City movement and other progressive nonprofits, I think we're seeing challenges of the growth machine, challenges of the development community that we didn't see a generation ago.
Okay.
I'm not prepared to predict that it's going to happen, how much longer it's going to play out. I'm here in Washington, D.C., where it seems everybody wants to move here. There's fear of gentrification in Anacostia, which is sort of like fearing gentrification on the west side of Chicago in the bad old days. I don't know how long that window is going to be open, but right now there are people who want to come to cities. And I think this is an opportunity that cities need to take advantage of and negotiate agreements because we may well get back to a time when it's white flight to the suburbs again.
When Harold was mayor, I talked with his chief of staff, Bill Ware. And Bill Ware told me that Chicago was the only city in the world where poor people were living on very valuable land. By that, he meant Cabrini Green, which was 7/8 of a mile away from the Gold Coast. Robert Taylor Homes, which was very close to the lake. Ida B. Wells, those public housing projects were close to downtown and very desirable property as things were changing. And he also pointed out that a Black mayor could never, because of his constituency was living there, he could never raise those projects and give it over to the developers. Daley did a whole lot of that when he got into office.
Mitch, I think you're next.
Yeah, so this is a question, and I don't know if you'll be able to cover them or not, but and this goes for all of you, but maybe mostly for Daley. In your research of these various mayors and their political machines and just the politics in general, did you ever find that they exacted like a sphere of influence on some of the suburbs, or how far out did their reach kind of go? And did some of them have longer reach than others, into other areas where they could use some of their political power and influence?
Yeah, Daley particularly did try and influence the suburban group and maybe Costas. I don't remember whether that's in your chapter. There's only so many words you can put in a chapter.
Right. And I'm trying to remember, maybe somebody can help me here. What's the organization, the regional, I don't remember what it is, but certainly he tried to.
It's called CMAP, Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning.
Yeah, exactly. So he took an active role from what I remember, and he also
worked with the Council of Mayors. In fact, was the convener of the Council of Mayors of the suburban mayors. There are actually 3 sets of them, but Daley wanted the support. He needed the support of the suburban mayors, for instance, for the O'Hare expansion.
That's right.
And he wasn't perfect at it. There hasn't been anybody who's been really good at involving the suburbs and the city in a comprehensive way, but Daley was interested in doing that more than most of the mayors, certainly more than say Harold or Gene were doing very, very much in. And Lori has been too busy with other things to get into that so far. Emmanuel was less. So I think probably Daley was the most aggressive in trying to enlarge the influence out to the metropolitan region, partly because he was there so long and was so secure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very much so. Yeah, absolutely. I thought of how he protected a lot of, there were lawsuits against O'Hare and the noise and all these things, and he took a very active role in trying to protect all that. And again, he operated as a regional emperor in some ways towards the latter part. He was comfortable enough to do that.
As a member of the media, I interpreted that a lot with, there was a move for a 3rd airport in Peatone. And Daley did not want that because he would have had to lose power. He had to split with the governor on control of the regional air in general. So he was willing in seeing something go to Indiana, to Gary, but he did not, he was not interested in another airport in a suburb in Illinois because he would have lost some power.
Yeah, that's an interesting observation, Monroe, because what comes to my mind, and you're trying to sharpen the memory here, obviously in some ways, he supported Midway too, to upgrade Midway. And in fact, there was a proposal to privatize Midway during the very, very end. He attempted to consider Midway like the Skyway as the possibility of it viewed as an asset, but he invested in Midway too. That's a good observation about Peatone.
There's a lot of information in the chat. Scott, you have been posting there a lot. You want to make some of your comments to everybody and allow the authors to respond?
Well, the part about when Mayor Washington passed away, that immediately brought back memories. That week, if I remember correctly, it was on a Wednesday, I think it was. I was homesick from school and remember getting the first news of Mayor Washington going to the hospital on the WGN midday news. And then from there, it expanded into the news that he had passed away, which was, kind of mind blowing to be witnessing at the time. And then watching the succession play out in the days that followed, like you described, where they're trying to cut backroom deals. And I remember the images of the lobby of the city hall being, filled with people. Just, watching all that, it brought back a lot of memories.
Yeah, that's in my chapter.
May I just also say that there's something about leadership, and especially questions of race and leadership, that are not quantifiable as such, but obviously explain the question that Dick opened with, right? Is why would somebody from South Africa be interested in, Harold Washington? And right, so there is that dimension that we would like to also highlight, especially in light of where we are today, in light of the racial polarization. What does it take to have a progressive, not just a progressive reformer, but a progressive Black reformer, right? What does Harold Washington tell us about that possibility? And there's also something about his story, about his death, which tends to appeal to people across cultures. He didn't die quite like, the way somebody like Steve Biko died, but the sense of an unfinished business and the sense of some kind of martyrdom, right? And it's not necessarily martyrdom in his case, but there's people across cultures always have this sense that, something could have turned out in a different way. And that can be quite inspiring as well. But obviously, history doesn't proceed in a straight line, right? Was it Kant or was it Isaiah Berlin? But right, the idea that out of the crooked timber of humanity, nothing ever straight ever came, right? So there are these contradictions. There's this movement forward that happened with Washington, but then there's the sense of regression that happens under Daley. But I was really happy to learn about this connection, which I've never made before, between Washington and Sawyer. So, Mr. Anderson, you are likely to hear from me in regard.
Okay, I'd love to hear from you. Yeah.
So one of the
Could I-
things the authors should probably keep in mind, following up on that comment, is to make sure that each chapter explains the leadership and legacy in a way that's powerful for the reader and makes some distinction, because what Washington did and what Sawyer did and what Daley did, they're very different manifestations. They could all be called in a way leadership. They can all have a legacy, and it's not the same leadership or the same legacy. And Betty has tried in her introduction to at least capture some of the polarity between the general forms of the establishment mayors and the progressive reform mayors that Chicago goes back and forth with. And you've got some people like Sawyer who are sort of in between. So we're trying to tell a very specific story, and we're telling it from the position of the leader, the mayor, but it's really the story of Chicago in this different era. What is possible in each era, what can be achieved in each era, what did each mayor contribute or fail to contribute to each era, and trying to do that in a single volume. Remember how many years we're covering and how many hundreds of political players are involved in this drama. That's what we're trying to refine in this book. Sean, you've had a couple of comments in the chat. Do you want to make some of those directly so that the authors and others can see and hear them?
Yes, I can. I was kind of piggybacking off of something you had said, Professor. You started to speak about the arrogancy, I guess, that, kind of was displayed through Daley. And I guess my larger question was, isn't that indicative of a lot of elected officials that we have in office. You know, even with like aldermen that seem to stay long term in office, it seems like at some point or another they end up, you know, on the wrong side of the law. The longer they're there, it seems like they're less of a benefit or asset to the community the longer they're there. So I kind of get worried about people that have like 20-year terms. That seems to seems to kind of go awry. So I was just kind of commenting on that.
One of the things that all of you have made me think about was to what degree does each mayor build on his predecessors? And Zalila, I think you were talking about regression. You know, sometimes it's a regression. How did this mayor regress from the person right before him? How did they progress? How did they not do things that they might normally have done? I don't think Richie Daley would have been as open about some things as after Harold Washington being the mayor. He might have just been another version of his old man and he might have gotten elected. But he couldn't do that anymore because Harold had been in and had changed things so much.
Yeah. As I think Dick says in one of his writings that, you know, Harold had kind of raised the floor or the ground of government. But I also want to concur with, Sean's point about corruption. I mean, in South Africa, we came into government with all these dreams and because the ruling party has been in power for 3 decades, right? It's easy for corruption to just set in because people have this sense of invincibility. But we also make the point about, I think, correct me, Greg, but it's about Ed Kelly, that, towards the end of his mayoralty, he also got into this mindset and became corrupt. And, that led ultimately to his unpopularity in Chicago.
Dick, could I?
Yes, go ahead, Greg. I'm sorry, Kostas?
Yeah, I was wondering if our colleagues can talk about Harold Washington's view and Sawyer's or beyond, I guess, their treatment or their view of downtown development and maybe tourism too. I was wondering if you can comment on that. I think that'd be obviously very clear in terms of Daley, but I was wondering your thoughts on that before or leading up to it.
So one of the things I would comment that I knew about and that had been suggested by the authors of the Washington chapter is Harold's big contribution wasn't downtown development, although he did the projects that got underway, like finishing Jane Burns' first revival of Navy Pier and so on. But his big contribution was the idea of balanced development, the idea that it was not enough to do economic development downtown, but you had to do economic development in the neighborhood. And that eventually would lead to the planned manufacturing districts, which then Daley would continue talking about the floor. The floor worked on various policy issues. So yeah, I think you can see, I don't know, Monroe, I never had a sense of whether Gene had any policy related to downtown or not downtown?
Gene was following Harold's blueprint, period, because he had been attacked by the Evans faction as a tool of the 29. And so he was doing everything within his power to prove that he was no different from Harold, that he would finish off Harold's policies. And so, no, there was no interest. In fact, we had a chance to get the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And I talked to them about that, and they didn't do anything with it. I mean, they just shrugged it off, the people in the planning department and what have you, because they were under fire. That was the problem. They were, from day one to the last day, the Sawyer administration was under fire. So the only 2 major things that he accomplished I can think of is the human rights law, which Harold had tried to do, and he wasn't able to do it, and lights at Wrigley Field. And other than that, I can't think of anything else major. And the rest of the time, it was battle after battle after battle with the Evans factions battling him, and the former 29 crowd trying to make him get them jobs and contracts and what have you.
Greg, you had
Yeah,
comments?
I want to. Well, first of all, I'm from Cleveland, so the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame ended up exactly where it should be. I think we need to be,
I was upset.
I think we need to be careful about how much emphasis we put on leadership. I mean, I think it's important, but here, I guess I'm speaking as a sociologist. I think context is important. When we think about the two dailies, the demographics of the city changed dramatically. And when Harold Washington was coming along, Pierre Clavel was writing about the progressive city. Gail Sincata, a Chicago product, was leading the community organizing efforts around the country. And in more recent years, we have progressive mayors in Seattle and in Portland and Minnesota. As I said before, the right to the city movement. There's a lot of things going on today that a mayor has to be taken into consideration that Richard J. Daley didn't have to think about in his day. So I think we need to think about leadership and context simultaneously when we try to explain what's going on, and particularly when we try to anticipate what our options might be going forward.
Betty, if you'd make a
also
note
wanted
of that for us as editors, I think that's right, that we want to keep a balance in the chapters about context and leadership.
Yes.
I also wanted to say that, to be cautious about how that we don't romanticize Harold Washington either. And I mean, he was a politician after all. And I mean, he did think, answering your question, Costa, he did think that large projects were important. But he was always kind of like weighing the political factors involved. For example, with the World's Fair, he didn't come out in opposition to that until he saw which way the wind was blowing. So he was quite astute in that way. I mean, the library, he saw the library as a big, in a city like Chicago, there was the idea that you couldn't be a successful mayor unless you had had a big project. And so he was always conscious as well of that. Although, of course, his heart and the bent of his administration was in the neighborhoods. And that's his, I think, significant legacy. And that's how it also shapes, as Betty said, how people like Richard Daley, M. Daley, act after him.
That's an interesting observation. And I'm trying to remember here, so forgive me if I'm getting it wrong here, but I do remember that, or at least, and I've written about this, but you forget a lot of these things. During the construction of the new Comiskey Park, Harold Washington certainly did not support the residents who opposed its construction. Instead, ended up, supporting the team to get the new ballpark right across the street. So, and some viewed that as not really being, that he wasn't really doing what he could do to advance their interests.
Yeah.
And didn't he support a Soldier Field renovation that he took a lot of criticism for at the time?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, he was criticized quite a bit. I mean, there's a chapter by somebody called John Bram in Pierre Clavel's collection, which is quite hard-hitting on Harold Washington from the neighborhoods standpoint. Even Hal Byron, who was his chief policy advisor, could be quite critical. So I think it's important for us to kind of like just bring that rounded, much as we love Harold, we have to also provide a rounded picture that makes him only human, quite frankly.
Let me ask the students in the group today, what did you learn from the discussion of mayors that you might not thought about related to urban studies before? For those that are authors here, our students come from education, urban planning, political science. So they come from a variety of interdisciplinary and specific other disciplines. So students, what do you take away from today that helps you in some way think about or understand? And Mitch, you have your hand up first.
Yeah, I mean, and a lot of this class plays this role for me. I mean, I work in government relations and I do it for the University of Illinois system, but just as an interest, as a career professional of government relations, community relations. And I think that this class in general plays a role in helping influence my understanding of communities and how they develop and the longstanding kind of issues that, challenges that politicians have played in either addressing or not addressing in different communities. And so I think that all of your chapters on the mayors have helped me understand a lot better about how communities might look at that, right? The ways and the legacies of different mayors and, kind of whether they're jaded or otherwise, and how they would approach things that we might propose one day. So it just, the context of the political context and the way that all of these different people interface with the neighborhoods and all of these communities, it helps me understand the historical knowledge, if you will, of all these different community groups and how they might approach current issues given that information. So I appreciate that a lot from my standpoint as a government relations professional.
Some of the rest of you and what you have learned or what you would like to see in the book that maybe we haven't gotten in there yet?
That Harold Washington's win was partly based on luck, that two other guys got 31 or around 33%. That's why he was able to win, and that Harold Washington at first was hesitant to join the race. So I found that surprising, in that I thought the mayor would have just decided, well, we have to run, make Chicago better. But no, actually, there was a lot of hesitancy and thinking that he might have lost, he might lose, and also that his win was partly based on luck.
He had run against Richard J. Daley and lost earlier. And when he didn't want to run because he had just gone to Congress, and he really liked being in Congress. And
so he was leading the movement against Reaganomics. Reagan was president at the time, and he had a very major role, even though he was a freshman congressman, a young not many years in Congress. But for the Black Caucus and for Congress more generally, he was one of the most outspoken against Reagan. And so he was having a nice role on the national stage.
Right.
And he had several demands that were very practical. So he was saying to himself, I don't want to have a replay of 77 and, get 20 or 30% of the vote and go home. I want to, if I'm going to run, I want to at least have a chance to win. And his two conditions were that the supporters who were all rah, Harold, why don't you run? He demanded they go get at least 50,000 new registered voters, mostly from the Black community, but in general, from his, could be a support base. That is, he would change the electorate from the one that he had lost with before. And secondly, that depending on who's telling the accurate story, and I can't quite sort this out, that he get $150,000 or $250,000 in contributions. And in fact, the community, the supporters did get 100,000 people to register, and they got a businessman to put up $250,000 to start the race, which meant that Harold wasn't starting from zero, and not just really running on his fame or his past experience, but starting with money and a support base that would make it an effective race.
Yeah,
So it
and
was a very pragmatic kind of beginning to Harold's campaign.
Yeah, and Jane Byrne had alienated the Black community so much because Black Chicago was responsible for putting her in office.
Yeah.
They were her support base. And then she quickly went with what she called the evil cabal. And the straw that broke the camel's back was when she named these 3 women from the South West side of Chicago, which was an all-white group, and 3 white women onto the school board, where most of the students were Black. And that was just a slap in the face. So from that point on, there were meetings on the west side of town and the south side of town, trying to decide who should be the Black mayor to run against her. And eventually it boiled down to Roland Burris or Harold.
Yeah.
And Harold was the guy.
Others of you have commented, talking about the students who've been, hearing all of this and hopefully read the chapter drafts that were sent to you. What did you learn, or what did you not get that you would like to have, Guadalupe?
So something that I learned, I just really appreciated the perspective between like the reform and establishment mayors that everybody gave, especially for Lori Lightfoot. I'm a teacher, and coming from the union consistently giving us a specific narrative about her, especially during the strike and through all of the issues leading up to reopening the schools because of the pandemic, just the narrative that we consistently hear from her is that she's a bad mayor. She's not progressive. She doesn't support schools. She doesn't support the community. So I appreciate being able to learn about her from this like completely new lens and perspective from you guys. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Great, Guadalupe. We'll have the chapter. Rosaire is going to be presenting that chapter next week in our session. Other comments, suggestions, ideas, perspectives that you've gained, and it may be true for the authors as well. Just hearing each other. Yes, Veronica.
Yeah, so I guess I always thought of globalization in terms of like the economy and kind of like tourists, especially in the Chicago context. But after reading the chapters and after listening to the authors here, I was thinking of the cultural impact that Washington had and how that has influenced and brought in a lot of different scholars from different parts of the world. So thinking of globalization in that sense, and even putting Chicago on the map. So in that sense, and I did have a quick question. So I was wondering how or what happened to that cultural impact that Washington started in his term, during Sawyer's term, and even during the Daley term. How did that change, or like did it change at all, or what happened to it?
So Monroe and then Costas.
Again, Sawyer was trying to be Harold Washington's clone without not being able to be very eloquent and not having a power base. We went on a couple. We went to San Juan for a concerned citizens meeting, but it was mainly for him to figure out how he's going to consolidate his base, if he could consolidate his base among the Black community. And we had sister city program. We went to Sweden because the Bears were playing there in one of those exhibition games. But much of his time was spent trying to figure out how he could keep his office. Because what happened early on in his term, Evans people sued to have an election because Sawyer was acting mayor. So they sued to get an election before Sawyer would get a chance to fill out all of Harold's term. And so Sawyer didn't get much of a chance to do anything. Like I said, it was from January of 80 January of 88 to April of 89 that he's in office, and that was it. And it was, he's being pelted from both sides most of that time. And plus, I don't think he had much of a vision on that level of reaching out or anything. The only way we got the human rights bill, he got the human rights bill because he wasn't comfortable doing it because the Black ministers weren't comfortable with it. But he had a meeting with the gays, and after the meeting, he said he didn't think he could do it because the ministers were really, Black ministers were really upset with him. And I said to him, I said, it's the right thing to do. So they're being discriminated against the way we were discriminated against. And I don't know if that was the final thing that changed his mind, but he did change his mind.
And he was helped in this particular situation. It was peculiar. Richard M. Daley lobbied a couple of the key white aldermen that were necessary to have the votes to get the majority. So you had Sawyer, leading the charge on the human rights ordinance, and Daley supporting the human rights ordinance because he wanted the support of the gay community in the next election, and just the cultural change in times that we were talking about,
right,
that were happening earlier. Kostas, your comments on Veronica's questions?
Well, yeah, what I was going to note is that culture, entertainment, recreation were the driving forces of the Daley period, certainly from the very pushed extensively. Obviously, in order to advance that vision, you need to have an infrastructure. And so that's why the redoing Navy Pier, museum camp, all these things there, that massive infrastructure that now is there on the lakefront was the result of that vision for, and the other thing that's also interesting those years and were there were festivals and there were constant events along the lakefront, dancing and all these events were taking place that that necessitated that infrastructure and that investment on the part of the city.
Yeah, but I give Jane Byrne credit for that because until she became mayor, I mean, Richard J. Daley wouldn't even allow outdoor cafes. He said it would draw rats. And when Byrne became mayor, it was party on time. And Harold continued with that, as did Sawyer. And then Richie, of course, came in and institutionalized all of it.
And he, remember, you have in the background, you have Lois Weisberg, who had been appointed by Harold Washington as the head of cultural affairs, carrying all the way through to Daley and being able to implement all these policies in the Daley administration that had started back under Harold, that had expanded on the Byrne ideas of festivals and so forth. So that we were really taking advantage of the cultural opportunities. And then there's a long story about who Lois Weisberg was and why she had this particular vision, and why she eventually left the Daley administration in protest. Which is an interesting side story we're not going to put in our book because we don't have another 10,000 words to do it. But in terms of cultural impact, Veronica, if you say that, Harold was creating a certain template of, affirmative action, good government, progressive ideals and so forth, what was sometimes called a progressive regime or progressive government back in the language of that time. That is carrying forward to under Daley. You have this vision of Chicago as a global city. There's no doubt that Daley didn't make Chicago a global city, but Daley presided over us becoming a global city. He put the powers of government behind us becoming a global city. And we really did advance onto the global stage in a way that was a little different from how we had advanced on the global stage under Harold Washington, where yes, Chicago was known and everybody around the world knew who Harold was. But the Daley period, we became for the first time a global city in the way we weren't under any of the previous mayors. Other comments or
I just want
questions?
to add a little bit here. You must
Please.
remember the time, right? This is the 1980s, and globally, right? There are all these movements in Eastern Europe, in the Soviet bloc, in South Africa. And so Harold also, the story of Harold also has that dimension to it, that, it's a time when people are looking for progressive models of leadership. So that's the globalization of ideas, basically. That's a very important point.
Yeah, it is.
And he becomes a global figure also for that reason.
Right. And because that was happening, may have also contributed to his being elected.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Any final comments? I know some of our speakers have to leave, so I'm gonna end us a little earlier than our usual time of 6:30 here Central. Any last comments, any thoughts, any suggestions? We're going to get to continue the last half of the book and find out the rest of the story of Chicago from Daley to Lightfoot. But any other suggestions you can have? By the way, any of the students, feel free to write me, and I will pass your comments on to the appropriate author and to Betty as we bring this book together. This is and in terms of the class, we've been talking about the Chicago School, the new Chicago School, and this is an interesting twist because the earlier books, one of them was on Chicago theory. The 21st Century Chicago book is on much more the different aspects of the metropolitan region and globalization. And now this book is on what might be almost called pure history. What does history contribute to the way the Chicago School understands? And the one thing I would say is that I guess we would say we take history seriously. That is, we don't think that we can understand the urban by simply looking at whatever is happening today in today's headlines or the news or the social media. We think we have to have this context, this longer story. And as we were saying, it's not a straight line. It hasn't gone from Harold Washington to Lori Lightfoot in some sort of easy path. It's gone down a crooked path, an up and down path, a change path, and history isn't ended. So who knows if Lori Lightfoot decides not to run for re-election or if she's defeated, the story may reverse again. And we may have a different twist coming in 2023. So it's an ongoing evolutionary thing, but we're trying to understand it within this framework of context and change. Not only the mayor is the great person or figure, but also the context of society and what is being demanded of the time, that the times are demanding. One of the sort of phrases is when the people are ready, the leader will arise. People create the leader as well as the leader leading the people. So this is a lot we're trying to struggle with, and you're welcome to help us. And I want to thank the authors who are here with us tonight, and don't forget your deadlines on your chapters. We will be, Betty and I will be back in touch with each of you. Thanks to all of you for being here. And for most of you, we'll see you next week. The authors are welcome to come back for the last half of the book to see how the story ends as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Rodrigo, did you have that's applause. I'm sorry. I thought it was a question.
Thank you, Rodrigo.
Okay, I'm going to end the meeting for all now. Thank you all.